I think as a thinking person, whether even if you're writing non-fiction or any other form, you are affected by what's going on. And you are thinking, okay, this is the way it's unfolding now. How will it look 10 years from now? What would it mean for a young person 10 years from now to go to school and not read about large chunks of our history because they're simply not in the textbook anymore? I mean, it's an incredible thought, and it's incredible, but it's not unknown in the history of the world that, dispensations have wiped out periods of history because it didn't suit their view of the nation, of the culture of the nation.
Hello everybody, this is Jaipur Bytes at the Samsung Galaxy Tab S9 series Jaipur Literature Festival. We are at the VFS Global Friend of the Festival Lounge, and we are recording this episode in collaboration with Itihāsology's History series. I'm in conversation today with a spectacular Anjum Hasan, and we are going to be speaking about her world of writings, what makes her want to write and tell stories, and a very important contribution that she's made with her 7th book right now, History's Angel. What's the story and why is it important to tell this story today? Because even if it might be rooted in fiction, it does speak truth to power. But before we go that, Anjum, we'd like to start with your journey into the world of writing. What makes you want to write, want to tell stories?
Thank you so much, Eric. Like you said, this is my 7th book, so it's a good time, I think, to pause and ask that question, because when you are starting out, even when you're sort of 2, 3, 4 books down the line, I think you're still wondering, is this what I really do? Is this what I actually do? Is this the only thing I do? Yeah. And I've always also done other things. I used to work, in fact, with an arts foundation that supported very different kinds of things across the arts. Filmmaking, writing, music, dance. And I would see writing as this little underground secret thing I did. And I'm also talking about a time in Indian publishing and in Indian literature that was much more low-key, and it wasn't very long ago. Yeah. It was, my first book was published in 2006, which is a book of poems called Street on the Hill. And then a novel called Lunatic in My Head came out in 2007. 2 years later, I published another novel called Neti Neti. But those are the years I'm talking about, where it felt like writing is still somewhat underground, self-sustaining kind of thing. And there were several publishers around. There were definitely not as many literature festivals around as there are now. And there is a part of me that still feels that those early years in my writing journey were very, very valuable for the fact that I was doing it so almost anonymously, I would say. Those books were received really well. They got a reasonable number of readers, but I still felt that this is not something that, I need to make a career of. Yeah. That writing is best done as a vocation. Yeah. It does not need the pressures of what sort of career am I going to make out of this? Because the concerns of the novel, and it's really the novel that is my favorite form. I mean, I also write short stories, I also write poetry, I write essays, I write criticism. But the novel is something I keep coming back to as the central thing I do. The most difficult, but also the most rewarding. So, to go back to that idea of writing as a vocation, and like you've picked up in my latest novel, I tend to write fiction that speaks to what's going around in my world or in our world at that time. So Neti Neti, for instance, the second novel, is about Bangalore just as the whole IT boom and outsourcing boom was taking off. It was published in 2009, but I'm talking about the period maybe about a decade before that, where a lot, like droves of young people were moving to Bangalore to work in IT. My heroine in the novel works in an outsourcing company that does very, very much like a coolie job, subtitles for Hollywood films. And that's only one example of the dozens of kind of things that were outsourced to India, still are maybe, but that was really like very much the era of outsourcing very, very back-end work, right? And what does that do to the soul of a young person who's working in a well-paid but really like pretty much soul-killing job? So the emotional life of a young woman from a small town who moves to this big bad city, and lots of money, lots of parties, lots of freedom, but she's still not sure that she's happy. So yeah, so I think because I'm trying to find a way to write very contemporary novels, I'm looking out of my window. I'm looking at what's happening on the street. I'm looking at what I'm reading in the papers. I don't watch television, so not that close. But it has to be some distance. But and I'm not much of a social media person either. But I am still trying to take in as much as possible what's going on and make that into a story, make that into fiction like you picked up. So if that's what I'm trying to do, what's the best way to do it that gives me some of that quietness, the anonymity, the distance to do it? And that's why, like I said, the writer or the novelist as somebody who sees their work not necessarily as a career but as a vocation. Since then things have changed, and I think I'm more of a writer now than I was then. But yeah, we'll talk about it.
So you said something very interesting, that you ask yourself this question: what would this do to her soul? And and you also said that you're looking out your window and you're looking, seeing, picking on things, bringing them to this fictional map, but again being very aware of this coming out of everything that you see around you. But you say that you're not on social media, and we are living in an hyper social media where your lives that you are sort of projecting on social media are very different than the ones that you may see around us. So have you seen your way of writing change, even if you're not picking up from social media, because you are still living in a contemporary period wherein people are engaging with it, people who are your subjects? So how has the process of picking on these souls been like?
That's a very, very scary question because I think I'm going to have to address it, Eric, in a novel soon. I haven't actually yet done it because all the novels I've written and even the short stories so far have actually been about people who are a little anachronistic. They're not quite in step with the times. And you'll know that about Alif, my latest hero, the hero of my latest novel, is completely out of sync. He barely can manage a cell phone. He certainly is not on social media. So I am attracted to characters who are not up to date in this very technological or even sort of practical way. They're a little clumsy, they're a little dreamy. They tend to be guarding their own inner lives, and one way to do it, of course, is not to give in to the inducements of the present always. They tend to do that, all of them. The heroine of my previous novel, The Cosmopolitans, when I wrote it, I thought of the idea of failure I was thinking of failure, especially in relation to being an artist. What if you always wanted to succeed as a painter or a visual artist? And what if you didn't? What sort of life would you then make as somebody on the fringes of the arts world, knowing it very well, having friends from there, having had ambitions to be an artist, but you never actually made it? And again, we don't have enough space, I think, to talk about failure unless we can offer some kind of parable or moral lesson from it. Like, doesn't matter if you failed, you can pick yourself up, and we write a self-help book about it. But what about failure as really soul-changingly hard and crippling? So to answer your question more pointedly, I have not written about people who live one sort of life online and another in the real world. I think it's a very, very zeitgeist kind of question to ask, and I think I would like to maybe write another novel about a young person, maybe set in Bangalore, which is talking about this thing.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. We'll wait for that. But I would like to pick on time then, because you say that your protagonists are not, so let's not say up to date with their time, but perhaps are not conforming. They are not willing to, because sometimes the time that you are surrounded with, you do not relate to. which I think speaks, this is rather ferociously spoken about, even if it not explicitly mentioned in your new work, in which you look at history, which is all about time. And it starts with time, which is something that, the start of the book, and I would like you all to experience it, so I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it starts with time. And you locate yourself in Delhi. You locate yourself in Delhi, which is literally a city of cities. It has histories after histories. And you are locating yourself in a time where the entire subject of history is becoming a battleground. It's becoming a quest for truth. It's becoming a black and white territory. So, what was it that led you to this story? What made you write History's Angel? And then we'll come to how you are not geographically either located in Delhi, you do not have a background in history, and yet you had to tell the story.
Well, I think the whole journey of writing is, in one sense, a journey of challenging yourself in increasingly harder ways. If you're not doing that, how are you growing? You can't write the same book over and over again, right? So I did write books about not characters exactly like me, but set in places and situations that I was fairly familiar with. Cities that I had lived in, Shillong, Bangalore, the arts world, because like I said, I was working in an arts foundation. So I was picking little things and making large fictions out of them. But history to me felt like you can't not write a novel about ideological battles if you are somebody who, I can't say that I'm in any sense a victim. I don't see myself as somebody at the front lines of religious battles, communal battles, ideological battles, but I think as a thinking person, whether even if you're writing nonfiction or any other form, you are affected by what's going on. And you are thinking, okay, this is the way it's unfolding now. How will it look 10 years from now? What would it mean for a young person 10 years from now to go to school and not read about large chunks of our history because they're simply not in the textbook anymore? I mean, it's an incredible thought, and it's incredible, but it's not unknown in the history of the world that, dispensations have wiped out periods of history because it didn't suit their view of the nation, of the culture of the nation. So I just felt like I have to write this book, but did not want to do it as an argument. It's not an argument. It is a meditation. I would see it more as a reflection on what's going on through the mind of a character who is, yes, right in the middle of the mess, because he's a teacher of history. He's teaching 12-year-olds. He's teaching 15-year-olds. He's in Delhi. He's in Daryaganj. He's a Muslim. He has family that is not very orthodox, but they are believers, and they are subject to prejudice. He is subject to prejudice. He does not want to see himself as the other or the victim or the guy at the receiving end of history. So how do you also retain your own integrity and independence at a time when it's very easy to become the pathetic guy who's always at the receiving end. I also wanted to fight against that and allow Alif some irony, some breathing space. And so where will he get that breathing space? It's not in the present, because in the present all the conversations are either about how much money you're making or which side of the fight you are on. Those are the two conversations. So the breathing space that I give my character is through history. History becomes his escape route because he's thinking really through Indian history, bits of Indian history in his head. I think especially related to Muslims on the subcontinent, and then he also goes into the larger Muslim history of the on the globe, because then he's thinking of the Ottomans. He's thinking, what was it like for the early Arabs to conquer such a large part of the planet? So it's actually threaded through the novel are little bits of Islamic history, then subcontinental Muslim history, but they're never there for him to vindicate himself. They're more a way for him to talk to himself.
No, I think it's very important that you mention that this is a meditation and that it is a reflection, because it highlights that it affects us all. And even if as I said, you do not have an academic background in history, but we are realizing that with novels like these are being written, are being read, because we are somehow feeling the same thing, that the past is being sort of perceived in a way wherein you are constantly othering, which is so impossible because you are a result of what now is considered this process of othering. And I would like to pick on the point of education and would like your inputs on that. It's when you talk about history in classrooms, and now there is a question of whether one should exclude certain parts of history, and then when one wonders that, well, isn't the subject about chronology too? I mean, there must be ideology that plays a part. But if you literally take out a time period, how do you make sense of times before that and after that? How do you think that in classrooms now and in a few years from now, the plucking out of certain parts of history can have larger implications?
One tends to think of China, I think, as a parallel. And I remember reading this Chinese novelist and essayist who, when he was writing this, was maybe in his 50s. He could have even been a little older. And he recalls going into classrooms to talk to young Chinese men and women, students, and realizing that they don't actually know that there was something like Tiananmen Square at the end of the 80s, which was this huge government crackdown on Chinese students and Chinese protesters against the regime. It's a incredibly well-known chapter in Chinese history. It only happened at the end of the 80s, which is like yesterday in the larger sweep of history. And there are these young people in China who don't know it happened. And of course, that is possible only in a much more closed society. I hope India will never become that kind of place. I hope that a young person, even if he's not reading about those things in the classroom, can go out and read about them. Because the other wonderfully ironic thing, I think, has been that even as we are clamping down or curtailing what a student is allowed to read or ought to read, the publishing industry, at least in English, I can't speak for the other languages, is just booming with writing on history. Look at this festival. Look at every second festival in the last few years and how many writers of popular history are emerging, which of course you know about if you follow publishing news, but they're also out there speaking about their work. So we are still not that badly off, I would say. As long as I can write about a character like Alif, who is disturbed about what's going on, that itself is a measure of freedom. It's not obviously an ideal scenario, because I shouldn't have to have a character like him being sort of put down the way he is eventually. Yeah. But just the fact that I can imagine him, I can talk about him, he's in that novel, I have the luxury of writing that, it's published, you read it, we can sit here talking about it. I can't take any of those freedoms for granted. I think they're still very, very valuable.
But do you think, because you're saying maybe you cannot read it in the classroom, so you go out and you pick out other history books, but of course, to write non-fiction, one is globally, recognizing that if you are producing that text and you are putting it out as a non-fictional work, then there is going to be questioning based on what kind of a history are you telling, and is this the kind of history that you should be telling. So do you think fictional spaces like yours, the worlds that you built, open up the possibility of saying, hey, I'm speaking to power, and this is happening, and yet it is located in that fictional time and space, and so is it a safety net? I wouldn't want to use that word safety net, whether fiction makes you safer to say these things, but can it be utilized as this tool, a very powerful tool?
I just remember the name of a Chinese writer, so I should mention that. His name is Yu Hua. And again, China is a wonderful example of fiction being used exactly to do what you said. Much more difficult society, much harder to say certain things, but fiction writers have tried to get around it through an allegorical kind of style. So certainly, I think you can use fiction to say things that can't be said in nonfiction, because nonfiction is very much making arguments, being however wonderfully written, it has to state certain things up front. With a novel, you need not come across as taking very clear sides. Of course, every reader of a novel knows where the writer's sympathies lie. I mean, every reader of History's Angel will know where my sympathies lie when they read this book. There's no two ways about it. But the thing with fiction also is that there are other things possible. Apart from the fact that you don't have to be black and white, you can also bring in emotions that are harder to do in nonfiction. And I think the one that I keep going back to is just brutal humor. Like, just the satiric quality of a lot that goes on that we consider everyday life and normal reactions to a novelist often seems so disproportionate and so uncalled for that the only way to do it, I think, is through a certain degree of satire. Yeah. But I'm not a satirist wholesale. I also pull back and become melancholy very quickly, so I don't sustain the satire. But yeah, all these things, right? Melancholy, satire, humor, joy,
They
beauty.
become coping mechanisms.
They're all coping mechanisms, and they all still exist. Delhi still offers incredible moments of beauty for Alif. He goes, sits in an old mosque. He doesn't pray. He's never praying. He never can bring himself to pray, but there is just something very calming for him in go sit in a medieval mosque and look at the tile work, think of the march of the ages, and these things are still available to a character in fiction, may not be so easy to do in nonfiction.
Absolutely, and I think you so rightly say that these spaces, history is something that the tangible remnants of what we are surrounded by, right? So there too, your concept of time becomes confusing, because the idea of going to a medieval monument in 2024, you're entering into another time, and therefore that sort of perplexes you, and therefore you're just blown away by what you're seeing. It's time manifesting itself in the form of a monument. So I realize those overwhelming moments that you capture in your book. But you mentioned Delhi, and before we end the podcast, that is one thing that I want to ask you. How was it navigating the checkered, complicated, and yet beautiful city of Delhi and its many pasts?
I am not an expert on Delhi at all. I've never lived there. I've often visited. I've been visiting for 20 years, and sort of piecemeal put together a picture of the city. And of course, even in those 20 years, it's changed so much. But what hasn't changed, of course, is bits of old Delhi, the Mughal monuments, the ruins. That whole feel of Delhi, I think two things have happened. One, things keep breaking down and disappearing in Delhi. I remember the writer Sam Miller, who's written a wonderful book on Delhi. He's here at the festival, Adventures in a Mega City, and it's a fantastic book. And he's walking in spirals around the city, and he says something about how every few days or every few weeks, one old monument in Delhi disappears into the dust. There's still several hundred at least.
Or shows up, and you become aware of, there's a monument.
Yes. You turn a corner, you look around a bush, and there's some piece of the past sticking out. But things are falling apart all the time. So in these years that I've been visiting, I don't know how much of that has happened. A lot of that has happened, obviously. But there's also more interest in the heritage. In the early days when I used to come here, there were no walks or heritage sort of awareness things. And now there's much more. There are people who'll take you around anywhere you want to go, and there's a belated sort of passion for the old city.
Yes.
And there are many wonderful books on the city that a novelist can draw on. I didn't directly drawn, anything, but just good writing on a city is always a joy to read. So yeah, so there was that fascination, but of course it's also a brutal city. It's also a city which is driven by power and money in a way that no other Indian city is. So I needed Alif to feel that alienation also, right? I mean, on a smoggy winter day when you're feeling like you can see the end of your life before your eyes because the air is so bad, and you're also feeling alienated by how everything is driven by these two things. You can't really relate even to people in your own family or in your friend circle. So that bleakness of Delhi is very special. And I've spent periods long enough, like I said, I've never lived there, but months at a time to know that that can really get to you sometimes. So that contrast to me was the most fascinating. The ruins, the beauty, the elegance of Delhi, and this feeling that it's the apocalypse. So, I have a line that goes, Delhi, the city where the apocalypse descends every day, and Delhi, the city where the apocalypse is always awaited.
Deeply evocative. And it is this sort of multi-layered essence of the city that is captured in Anjum's latest novel and in her other books, in which, as she said, she picks on souls that she sees out of her window and puts them in her fictional map. So please get yourselves a copy of her latest book and also all of her other writings. Anjum, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Wonderful questions.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody for tuning into this episode of Jaipur Bytes. Thank you.